Stonethroat swallowed the road and refused to let it pass. It wasn't a town, it wasn't a fortress, it was a choke, the old toll arch and gatehouse where the inland road pinched between stone walls, narrow enough that a single order could stop a convoy cold. An iron bar hung ready to drop. Beside it squatted a cart shed with wet straw and split timber. Beyond that, a reed-cut creek mouth opened toward the harbour, black and quiet. The convoy reached the arch and stopped, chain links whispering as the six shifted their weight in the middle of the road. The clerk was with them, satchel tight under his arm. The escort captain and the watch sergeant stood in the open beneath the gatehouse lantern. Adrian watched from the cart shed shadow. Corvin was beside him, close enough to feel without looking, while Team Hook waited behind them in silence. Team 2 was not in the road. Their work had already been done. If the paper held, it would buy them 6 men, 1 satchel, and 30 clean seconds of confusion. Under a hooded lantern, the watch sergeant looked pale enough to be sick, but his hands were steady when he raised the document. "By commission," he said. For one breath, Adrian thought Team 2's first prong had worked. The escort captain snatched the paper, read once, then again, and the anger in his mouth turned careful. The transport clerk hugged his satchel tighter, ink-stained fingers whitening at the seams. Originals, names, the kind of paper that could hang a man. Paper first, then bodies. Then the fog blinked. 3 short flashes, 1 long. Adrian's stomach dropped. Naval signal. They had planned for interference, not for a clamp. A pinnace slid into view at the creek mouth, low and silent. Marines braced along the rail with muskets and pikes, patient as law. Not bait, a closure. Corvin breathed, almost amused. So she brought the Navy after all. Lady Sebastienne Vale stepped out under the arch as if she'd been standing there all night. Her attention settled on the cart shed shadow as if she knew Vane would be listening.
2 paces behind her, her bodyguard drew twin nimchas, crescent curved blades, darkened and etched with thin silver ticks like tide marks and star pricks. Vale's voice carried, mild as a verdict. Captain Vane. Not just his 6, Adrian thought. Steele whispered. The bodyguard moved. He came in low and fast, both nimchas whispering through fog-cold air, one crescent high to catch Corvin's sword, the second already turning for the wrist. A pin, not a kill strike, meant to keep the biggest wan in the choke exactly where Vale wanted him. Corvin met the first blade with a hard clang that rang off the stone. The second kissed sparks from his guard as he turned it aside at the last inch. "Now," Adrian said. Hook team broke from the cart shed shadow, 3 men moving at once, 1 for the clerk, 1 for the escort captain, 1 for the chain. The clerk saw them too late. A palm crushed over his mouth and dragged him backward into wet straw. The satchel strap snagged on his sleeve, jerked tight, then tore free with a sharp rip of thread. The escort captain spun, hand going to steal. Adrian stepped into his path. He did not shout. He cut his voice just enough to carry. "Don't. If you draw, you force the bloodshed, and Lady Vale will swear she tried to stop it." That did it. Not because the captain believed him, because he believed the cost. The captain's fingers stayed on the hilt, but the blade did not leave leather. Beside them, Hook team's chisel bit the master ring that bound all 6 prisoners together. One clean strike, iron screamed. The line went slack. For a heartbeat, nobody moved. Then the 6 lurched apart, like men remembering they still belonged to their own bodies. "To the creek," Adrian snapped. "Move." They moved. The watch sergeant shouted from under the lantern. One Marine on the pinnace raised his musket, another leveled a pike toward the reeds. Corvin drove forward.
He did not retreat from the bodyguard. He advanced into the bodyguard, sword high, forcing the man back a half step, then another, making space the only way Corvin ever made it, by taking it out of someone else's hands. The bodyguard flowed with him, nimchars crossing and parting in silver-black crescents, beautiful in the way venom is beautiful. One fainted high, the other slid low. This time the low blade got through. A hot line opened across Corvin's forearm. Blood slicked the grip, his sword dipped 1 inch. Adrian saw it and hated the jolt in his own chest. Corvin did not look at the wound. He answered with a brutal cut that would have broken bone through steel if it had landed clean. The bodyguard twisted away, boots skidding on wet stone, and the blow smashed sparks from the arch instead. "Captain!" one of Hook Team barked. Corvin heard the shape of the field in that one word and answered with timing. He pivoted, caught the next nimchar on his guard, and gave ground exactly 3 steps, not retreating, dragging the bodyguard just far enough offline to open the road to the creek. That was when Team 2 struck. They rose from the reeds at the creek edge where they had been waiting all along, 3 dark shapes coming out of the wet rushes with clubs, hooks, and short steel. One slammed into the first Marine as he tried to level his musket. Another yanked a pike sideways so hard the man holding it went over the rail. The third hurled a hooded lantern into the pinnace's bow. Glass burst. Oil flashed.
Not a blaze, just a violent smear of light and smoke, enough to blind, enough to break aim, enough to turn discipline into confusion. The first volley cracked wild. Straw exploded behind the cart shed, wood splintered. A ball struck stone so close to Adrian's leg that chips stung his boot. One of the freed 6 stumbled. Adrian caught him by the arm and shoved him forward instead of down. "Run first, bleed later." Hook Team hauled the clerk with them, half choking, half thrashing, satchel clutched in one pirate fist. The escort captain still had not drawn. He stood rigid in the middle of the choke, trapped between fear of immediate blood and fear of the name Adrian had placed in his ear. Vale watched all of it, calm, dry-eyed, almost thoughtful. "Loose shot," she said to the Marines, and somehow the mildness in her voice cut cleaner than a scream. "You'll kill the witness. Not the prisoners, not the pirates, the witness." Adrian felt her meaning hit him like cold water. Corvin felt it too. He stepped between Vale's sightline and the creek, sword still raised, blood running down his wrist. The bodyguard came again in a storm of crescents. One nimcher hooked for Corvin's blade, the second hunted tendon. Corvin turned the first aside, let the second scrape his guard, and then slammed his shoulder forward with the weight of a battering ram. The bodyguard gave a sharp breath as steel and muscle crashed together. He slid back on the slick stones. "Go!" Corvin roared. The 6 were already in the shallows. Longboat men hidden low in the reeds surged up to meet them, dragging the skiff in by the painter line. Hands grabbed wrists, sleeves, belts. One prisoner fell to his knees in black water and was hauled bodily over the gunwale. Another nearly dropped the freed chain length and had it ripped away before it could tangle an ankle. Adrian shoved the last of them towards the boat. "Count! 6!" Hook Team shot back, breathless and disbelieving. The clerk made 7, gagged now with his own torn sleeve, eyes rolling white above the knot. Behind them, the pinnace was not disabled, only disrupted. Marines were already reforming through smoke and shouted orders. One had found his footing on the bank and was raising his musket with deliberate, hateful care. Adrian saw the line of the barrel settle. "Corvin!" Corvin turned, saw it, and moved without thought. He caught the bodyguard's next strike on pure instinct, kicked off the stone, and drove sideways into Adrian hard enough to throw them both off line as the musket cracked. The ball slammed into the bollard where Adrian had been, iron ringing like a struck bell. For a one-stunned beat, Adrian was against Corvin's chest, smelling salt, blood, wet leather. Then Corvin shoved him towards the water. "I need you alive," he said, raw and furious, as if the words had been waiting in him all morning. Adrian went. He splashed into the shallows, caught the skiff's edge, and Hook Team seized him under both arms and dragged him over the side with the others. The boat rocked hard, then steadied under weight and urgency. Corvin backed after them, sword never lowering. The bodyguard could have chased.
He was close enough, fast enough. The opening was there. Vale lifted 2 fingers. Hold. The bodyguard stopped, not from fear, not from mercy, from discipline. Corvin saw the signal. So did Adrian. "Push off!" Hook Team shouted. Oars bit black water. The skiff tore away from the reeds as another ragged volley cracked overhead. One ball punched through the sternboard, another hissed into the creek. Team 2 broke contact cleanly, peeling off the bank in pairs, one man leaping into the stern as the other shoved clear. The last pirate caught the gunwale one-handed, boots dragging a wake, and was hauled in by his collar before the dark could take him. Stonethroat shrank behind them into arch, lantern, smoke, and the pale shape of Vale beneath it. She did not call pursuit, she only watched. Corvin stood in the stern, bleeding, sword dark in his hand, eyes fixed on the choke until the fog swallowed it whole. Only then did he turn toward the harbor, toward the Black Gull, toward the victory that would cost him more than he knew. Adrian saw the blood running down Corvin's hand and started toward him, but the Black Gull reached them first. The Black Gull took them back like men already halfway legend, and that was the danger of it. The 6 came over the rail alive, the clerk came with them, and victory spread faster than discipline. Behind them, the coast was already fading, the last shape of land sinking into dark water and thickening dusk until sea and sky seemed to swallow it whole. By the time the shouting started, the rescue had become the kind of story men wanted to believe while it was still warm in their mouths, and stories make poor sentries. The party lived midships around the mainmast. Lanterns hung from the shrouds and turned the broad deck into a wavering gold room. Barrels became tables, crates became stools, dice clattered on a plank laid over casks. A fiddler sawed out a tune while boots hammered the boards. The women moved through it like they belonged to the ship. Damp hems, tight-laced bodices, bright scarves knotted at throats, cheap ribbons in their hair, earrings flashing when they laughed. They stole hats, climbed barrels, pulled pirates into spinning dances, kissed men like coin changing hands. Adrian told himself it was only tradition, noise after fear, heat after blood. Corvin climbed onto a barrel near the mainmast, cup lifted high, bare-chested and shining with sweat, his forearm bandaged tight, the cloth faintly pinking where the wound still wept. "6 on deck," Corvin said, and the cheer that answered him shook the rigging. He waited for the roar to thin, eyes bright with drink, then let his gaze find Adrian like a knife finding a seam. "And if you're breathing easy tonight, thank Harrow. He wrote the net that held them, and when my hands were busy, he finished the work." A beat, then mugs lifted. Someone shouted, "To Harrow," and the cry caught fast, rolling through the crew until even the women laughed and raised stolen cups. Adrian's face warmed. He managed a small lift of his own cup, because refusing would look like contempt, and he could not afford that. Corvin drank first. The party surged back into motion as if his swallow had released it. The ship wanted noise, and because it wanted noise, it stopped looking outward. Corvin came back from the barrel in a good mood, half drunk and bright-eyed, and sat beside Adrian as if he'd chosen him, not the crowd. Up close, lantern light did something unfair to him.
Bare chest, broad shoulders, the quiet strength that made even stillness feel like a touch. Adrian's attention caught and wouldn't let go, heat rising fast, sudden and unwanted. Corvin looked too controlled for a man half drunk, too solid, as if the night couldn't move him unless he allowed it.
Corvin leaned in to speak over the fiddle, close enough that Adrian caught rum and salt on his breath. He hooked an arm around Adrian for a heartbeat, warm and careless, the kind of rough affection men used when they were celebrating too hard. "You heard them," Corvin murmured. "They drank your name." Adrian's pulse jumped at nothing. "They're drunk," he said. "They'd toast a piss-pot." Corvin's mouth curved. His eyes lingered a fraction longer than they needed to. Then he lifted his cup toward him. "Still," he said, louder for the deck, "to Harrow."
The girls found him, laughing as they folded themselves against his sides, mouths at his jaw, hands roaming his ribs and stomach as if they had the right. Corvin let them. The deck expected it.
Adrian watched anyway. Too long. He tried to call it tactical, a captain in his element, a threat worth measuring. It wasn't. One of the girls turned and smiled at Adrian like he was a joke. "Join us, handsome lord." "No," Adrian said. "A shame," the other teased, sliding closer to Corvin. "He'd blush." The space seemed to tighten around them. The Black Gull celebrated like a floating sin, naked bodies tangled, laughter and rum loud enough to make the sea look modest. Lantern light found bare skin everywhere Adrian looked, and it hit him with sudden stupid clarity that he was the only one still clothed. Heat climbed his neck. He turned his head back to Corvin. His pulse was loud in his ears. Two naked girls were draped over him. One gripped him firmly. He was unmistakably hard in her hand, pressed against her palm while she watched him with possessive admiration. The other kissed all over him with hungry confidence, laughing softly between breaths. Corvin let it happen, half reclined, bandage stark on his arm, his hands roaming the girls like pleasure was just another prize he'd taken. The way Corvin seemed to enjoy it sparked something ugly in Adrian's chest. He looked away too late. The image stayed. Jealousy rose hot and humiliating in his chest. The anger surprised him more than the scene did. Adrian stepped back. Corvin caught his wrist, warm, iron. "Stay," he said. "We earned this." "Let go," Adrian snapped, pulling. Corvin didn't, not at first. Adrian yanked harder. Corvin's smile went careless. "Fine," he said, loosening at last. "More girls for me." The laughter swallowed it. The fiddle kept going. Corvin turned back into the heat of bodies and easy hands, as if Adrian hadn't mattered. Adrian walked away before his face betrayed him. No one stopped him. The deck's attention had turned inward, toward cups, bodies, music, and the safe lie that the danger had passed. He went forward past the foremast to the forecastle, where lantern light thinned and the party dulled to a muffled thump. No bow watch challenged, no call came from the rail. Adrian took 2 more steps and stopped. A man lay crumpled beside the forward bitts, half in shadow, one arm tucked under him the wrong way. Bow watch. Adrian knew the coat, knew the boots. For one stupid beat, his mind tried to name it sleep. Then he saw the dark wetness at the man's throat. Another shape lay by the rail, folded against a coil of line, too still to be sleeping, too heavy to be drunk, one hand hanging limp over the planks. They were aboard. Cold shot through Adrian's chest. He spun for the main deck, breath already rising. "Corvin!" A gloved hand slammed a folded cloth across his mouth. The smell hit at once, sweet and sharp and wrong, with something bitter underneath, like medicine turned sour.
An arm locked across his upper chest and pulled him back into the body behind him, pinning his head and smothering the warning before it could rise. Adrian thrashed on instinct, but the cloth pressed tighter. He dragged in one broken breath of it and felt the deck shift under him, a sick looseness rushing through his limbs as if his strength had stepped away from him. Below, a small vessel rode close to the bow. Too quiet. No lantern, no voices. It sat tucked beneath the hull's shadow, timed to the exact moment the deck was loudest. Two shadows crossed the foredeck fast, silent as thrown cloaks. The party roared on amidships, blind to it. Stonethroat had not been the end of Vale's trap, only the opening of it. Adrian tried to drive his heel down, tried to wrench free, tried once more to force Corvin's name through the cloth. Nothing came out but a trapped, useless sound. Lantern light smeared, the planks rolled beneath him, his fingers slipped. Then everything went dark.